Thank you for the very kind introduction, Dr. Anna Nyberg. It's a great pleasure to be back. I think this may be the fifth one of these seminars I've delivered, although this is the first one that presents a kind of review of work. And in preparing, I was asked to present a seminar. We volunteer maybe once a year, and I thought instead of presenting something new, why don't I present a kind of synthesis? I was building on something that Patrick Vallance, the scientific advisor to the government, said some years ago, that many of our studies focus on genesis, that is the creation of new knowledge, and very rarely synthesis, which is the combination of existing knowledge into some distilled lessons that we can quickly summarize and draw some interesting utility from. So I've decided to do a synthesis here today, and it will be, as most things I do, a lot of historical background, some discussion of the present, and then some discussion of the future. And thanks for joining. I look forward to this. I think it will be historically interesting to many of you, and also more broadly for anybody in the academic sector interested in what is usually called impact. I hope that there's some good stuff in here for you as well. So thanks for joining. 5 years of Project Hindsight in making history useful. So this is me. Anna kindly introduced my background. I did do a PhD in the history of science and technology. It was on work. It did connect to workplace metrics and consultants, which I suppose is the connection to today. A lot of this work has been developed subsequent to that, and often in different settings from an academic context with a funding council and so on. And it's been a great learning experience for me over the last 5 years, conducting all manner of wonderful projects with different kinds of people that I wouldn't normally get in a university setting. So I can see some of them have joined today, which is great. And so I hope it's been interesting for you too. Let's give you some insight into what we'll talk about. So Project Hindsight is not my terminology. I'm going to talk you through Project Hindsight 1.0, to coin a phrase, then move on to 2.0, which is 2010s onwards, discuss some current projects, which I'd love your insight on, thank you, and then some upcoming work, much more specific. So some of you may or may not know this. If you've been taught by me for the past 3 years, I've probably given you a little potted history of this. So Project Hindsight, I thought it was a great name, firstly, and it appears a little bit in the history books, but I've had to piece some of it back together from primary research. So original Project Hindsight took place at the US Department of Defense under its very famous Secretary Robert McNamara, who was, probably the epitome of the Cold War, lack of a better word, bureaucrat running both the private sector and the public sector and international institutions across those decades leading into the 1980s. So McNamara was president of the Ford Motor Company, which is an accolade in itself, and then was probably most famously the US Defense Secretary during the Vietnam War from 1961 to 68, and that's what I'll be talking about in this section of my seminar. Then less well known, but in a recent study by Heath and McCann, also became president of the World Bank, and for a long period of time as well. And there you can see his 1961 official portrait, his very famous, almost center parting. And when you look at these black and white pictures from the 1950s and the 60s of dozens of US kind of bureaucratic men, you can see him from a mile off because of that. And he also was kind of rediscovered by a new generation by the famous publications and film called The Fog of War, which came out about 20 years ago, I think now, when he was 85, I believe. And it's a fascinating series of interviews and lessons from his senior leadership. And to summarize again from this recent publication on his time at the World Bank, Bob McNamara has a reputation in a particular way, and they state that he is often characterized as a good manager, but a poor leader, notorious for failings associated with micromanaging by questionable metrics. And this then gets tied into a whole story about how the US conducted the Vietnam War and lost the Vietnam War, developing all kinds of ways of analyzing combat and deployment and research and so on during that crucial period in American history. But recent studies such as this one from last year, and I would argue what I'm revisiting of his career through this, say that perhaps there's some interesting things in there that we might be able to take a bit of a different slant too. Both the issue of good manager versus poor leader, that's what that study is about, but also this issue of questionable metrics. That's exactly what I'm talking about in this section of my talk today. So the US Department of Defense conducted this Project Hindsight. There's some of the original paperwork in the top left. Started in 1963 or 4, so slightly into McNamara's tenure. It's not in the official Department of Defense histories. I don't think there's anything sinister about that, even though they're very big books. They were not looking at the internal workings in the way that the study did. And it came in a context where they were studying research and development, particularly for military reasons, was becoming increasingly popular, such as the National Academy of Sciences in the United States and some lesser known studies in Britain. And then we're seeing several, so started 1963 or 4, published first interim report 2.5 years later, and then many other studies. And when I say published, I mean in the public domain, Science, Nature, places like this, well-known outlets. And so there's no secret here, yet it does not remain very well known. So, and this for any scientists or technology engineering colleagues listening, this is the bit you might find intriguing. And for humanities and arts and social science colleagues, you might find this bit a bit terrifying, especially historians who aren't used to discussing history in this kind of utilitarian, instrumental way, which is really, really one of the core points of my talk today, is making history useful, as I said. So I'll just talk you through the methodology, because I think you'll find this really interesting. You choose an important technology around you. This is all military technology. Then you assign scientists and engineers to analyze that, 5 or 10 of them. It's a lot. This is very, very labor-intensive activity. Then the team, and I'll talk about that in a minute, the team decide on crucial contributions in that technology's development, which they call events with a capital E, and all the reports have the capital E for this. For example, to quote the interim first report, the 1949 titanium aluminum vanadium alloy using compressor blades of the turbofan engine in the C-141 transport aircraft. Okay, as I'm sure we all thought of when I said a crucial technology in the 1960s. And then one scientist or engineer assigned to this to study, to kind of historically rediscover the research and development of that event, and in looking at, for example, who the team members were, the organizational structure, what were the set objectives, the funding streams, the cost, i.e. was it on cost versus off cost, and that's one event. And the Project Hindsight team, you can just see how labor intensive this was, applied this to 20 current systems comprising 638 events. And infamously at the time, depending on what side you're on, the general lesson derived was that 91% of these events that they thought were crucial in military technology development were technological rather than scientific, to use the language of the time. Now, as you can probably imagine, a big government agency in a very powerful country in a crucial historical defense period decided, many people decided this is worth critiquing. And the top one, Traces, that is a whole other book written just about analyzing Project Hindsight's interpretation of how to use history. And usually critiquing the methodology in a qualitative way, how to choose representative innovations, how to differentiate between what was then called mission and non-mission research. Those of you familiar with NASA, for instance, you'll know these terms, mission and non-mission. When do you decide when one technology stops and one starts? Very difficult. And then they looked at 5 additional civilian technologies: magnetic ferrite, videotape recorder, contraceptive pill, electron microscope, and matrix isolation. And then from a more sociological perspective, which is what I would have expected given the context of the time, you see critiques emerge of, for example, the implicit model of theoretical science leading to technology development, sometimes called the linear model. These analyses of science policy and research and development techniques have been developed very considerably in the last 50 years. And this, I think, is one of those moments when you see a certain kind of critique emerge, both from this sort of technical perspective and from the more sociological one. And I remember reading about this and thinking, at essence, is a really good project, using historical evidence to make key decisions. In this case, allegedly to channel funding less to theoretical research in science and more to technological application. Yeah, there was a big debate, nuanced debate at the time about all the complexities of this that I'm sure some of you are imagining. But at essence, why don't we use historical evidence perhaps more or to augment what's already being used in order to make better decision making? So it was 2014-15 when I finished my PhD, and I happened upon this and was looking for stuff to do. And I started teaching at Imperial College in 2014 on the Current Horizons program, which left me with some time. So I investigated this particular avenue of inquiry of mine. Who is out there trying to make history useful and relevant and applicable to the present and therefore the future? And there are some. There's the wonderful history and policy colleagues from Cambridge, King's College, and other institutions in the UK. Hello, if you're watching. There's the Harvard Belfer Center Applied History Project, which it's kind of lessons from usually geopolitical strategy, that kind of thing. It's very big thinking, quite a bit different from what I'm doing here. As I mentioned, the US Department of Defense took this very seriously for about 10 years. And there are out there anthropologists. I'm not an anthropologist, but if I was, there are some applied anthropology projects out there, often with people with PhDs in anthropology, work on what I would call organizational behavior or organizational learning, applying very good lessons to big corporations. I know Lego, VW, for instance, have been working with people I know from this kind of area. And it's very encouraging to see people taking academic, teaching, research, and applying it in the real world to make stuff work better. And as I say, in essence, that's really what I think we can do with history. And I'm really pleased there are lots of people out there that already agree with me. And hopefully you all do too. And I would like to talk, with your permission, about some projects we've been working on. So it impressed, when I wrote this down this morning, it really kind of struck me with how much stuff was written on this side and made me pretty proud, actually, with a budget of 0 to start with. No knowledge of how to find clients, no knowledge of how to run anything independently, no knowledge of how to get new people on board to participate in projects. I look back and then it's 6 years, sort of 7 years in total, but really starting properly 5 years ago, as I say. And it started with an accidental study I ended up in the law sector, in which the legal, I could do a full half an hour on this if you wanted to, but the legal case basically lacked historical memory. So the client of mine didn't know. It is we're talking like a big client, not a criminal one. And they didn't know if they'd done it, which is quite a basic historical piece of knowledge you would like to know when you're preparing a case, even to lose badly, right? Oh, sorry, to lose well or to lose badly. And in this case, you want to lose well, usually. So it was a matter of, I'll talk about some general kind of things I've learned, but this is a perfect case of the client not knowing what they want. They didn't, it wasn't a matter of go to an archive and find the piece of paper. But there was no knowledge there was any archives that could be of relevance, especially because the client's institutional memory is very weak, which I'll talk about in a minute. And so I had to derive a very a kind of thorough but quick research project to find stuff out, which is, as many of you know, if you're from an academic history background, finding stuff out is not the conclusion you get to. That's sort of step one. Then you have to analyze it and link it to other debates. So this was, it was the kind of the start of the research, but also it was the end of it, just writing it up as a short report. As I say, I teach classes on this now, so I could provide a much fuller version to anyone who's interested. But it was a matter of identifying what material might even be out there that I could find. Do I have access to this? What resources would I require? And then, so I prepared a proposal, and this is another lesson I'm going to pass on to anyone who wants to do this kind of thing. It was a Thursday. They phoned me back straight away and said, right, we'd like you to execute this. And I said, okay, when's the deadline? They said, week tomorrow. And it was lucky for me that I didn't have a great deal on that week. And I was able to really quickly do this, but it was all hours of the day type research. It was like almost, I know there's one or two people from a management consultancy background on this call. It was like that, right? When you just have to fill all the time with what you're trying to do for the client in a very short space of time. And anyway, I found what they wanted to know one way or the other, signed all the non-disclosure agreements, and then sent off my report. And they take, I think it was 2 years to pay me. So that's something else I've learned from this, is make sure you have good invoicing system. But we'll come back to more general lessons like that in a moment. So other areas which from 2015 to 19, I work with various colleagues, sometimes with teams of up to 5 people. Not that far off the original Project Hindsight kind of design, really, except it involved some historians as well. Looking into aspects of kind of research and development and technology development, like I've already said, basically, but this time in the modern day, less of a historian and more as an applied researcher, if you want to call it that. And I can give you a small amount of information on that later if you want, or if you want to talk about it some more, get in touch. Though, of course, I'm sure you'll appreciate it's some of the information will be sensitive. And then again, sitting down to do this, I didn't quite realize how many visiting lectures and training courses I developed. And this is only a few. Business schools, probably 3 or 4 of them, some universities as well, in addition to business school, history departments sometimes like this kind of thing. But also private sector, UK power networks, sort of NGOs like the Open Data Institute, of which I'm a key member. But also then over time, of course, I accumulated a bit more contacts, a bit more network. And then more central authority, as it were, started getting in touch, including twice the Cabinet Office, which, as I'm sure you know, is the centre of the civil service in the UK. And it was a great pleasure to talk with them at some sort of lunchtime lectures and convey some of this to them. And I hope they found it useful. And then more recently, for example, the National Centre for Entrepreneurship in Education. I also prepared, and this is again trying to fill the gap where no one's telling you there is a gap. I did a policy study with something called the Resolution Foundation, which is quite a well-known think tank, and in the UK, and they were preparing a bunch of work on the impact of technology on the workplace. And I just said, could you use some historical insights? And again, the client didn't know what they wanted. So they said, well, you tell us what we want. So I observed that Web 2.0 was preceded by Web 1.0. So why don't we do a study of Web 1.0 and see what the debates were about the impact of the internet on work, and related subjects like unemployment and skills and training and regional aspects of policy and so on. And it was great. Again, I had to design the project from scratch because there was no one overseeing this. But which is good fun if one enjoys taking full ownership of tasks, as I do. Then it was great fun. So I looked at all kinds of sectors, retail, care sector, trucking, and various car taxis, which is very topical at the time because of Uber, and produced a wonderful report with an amazing robot on the front. And I hope it was useful. And a lot of people got in touch with me after that to learn more about what I'm doing. And it was really nice to then be able to talk to some additional people. Now, from 2018, this is where things become more kind of relevant to Imperial College, because I realized that when I would mention this kind of work to students, and I teach many students every year, they were very interested. Not just because they want to learn about entrepreneurship, which we have specialists in that at Imperial College, but just the practicalities of the things I've mentioned. Finding clients. Client doesn't know what they want. How do you find out what they want? What are the basic things you want to know? And also trying to kind of build a niche, I suppose. And they found that intriguing, and they liked, instead of me just telling them about how to do it, because I'm still learning. They liked having a dialogue about this and saying, well, you could do this, you could do that, and so on. And indeed, some of the people on this call and some of the people who've written reports with me now sort of came to these kinds of work through me, And then we've now gone on to do projects together. So it's really great. So I didn't intend this to be a kind of recruitment mechanism, but some alumni then got in touch after they graduated, said, is there anything you want to work on? Because I found this very interesting. And I'm really grateful for them doing so, because also something with this, historians typically work alone. And if they don't work alone, they might co-edit a book where they've got individual chapters written by individual people, which is still working alone, really. So it was great for the first time really in my academic career since, as a kind of research assistant before my PhD, when I used to work on health policy, working with people at every step of the way, from research design to delivery. And as I say to people when I'm delivering things like this, I mean, that is something to really think about. Is, it can be, research and writing can be quite a lonely business, and I personally really enjoyed expanding out to work and write with others every step of the way. And it made it more enjoyable, more sociable, but also more effective. I spent less time procrastinating or going down some rabbit hole for days when someone else could have said, that's interesting, but it may not go anywhere. Let's focus on this other thing. And if I could say to anyone who's doing research right now, if you do find yourself procrastinating and going down rabbit holes, perhaps a bit of co-working could really help, because it has with me. So as I said, I now do classes on this each year in both history and digital studies, talking through some of the projects I'm about to outline. And then some of you may have attended a session this time last year with myself and Dr. Mark Pope, where we talked about critical futures and did some kind of training, collective imagination, if that's the word. And that's been great fun, again, to work with someone else who knows maybe more about the subject than me, and I can learn as well. And then I just wrote down reports produced by what used to be just me, and now is an institution with people in it, which is, to me, I need to sort of step back and think, actually, that's really cool. So I did an investigation into what I call data loss and its impact. They got made into a really cool film, if you could go and look at that. Myself and Mark Cox-Smith, who may be here today, did, this was during coronavirus. He got in touch and said, is there anything we could work on together? And I was just looking at something that Unilever had done in the 60s. Again, the 60s is a real futurist analytical moment. So 1963, I think it was, they predicted 1984. We then got the actual data from 1984 and worked out what Unilever were right about, what they had gotten wrong, what the assumptions were, and anything we can learn about that. And it was not only a challenge doing the research, but doing a challenge during the lockdown of what one can find. And in the end, we found, I think, everything we wanted to, but which was instructive also in itself. So again, this kind of entrepreneurial activity, you never know what you're going to learn, right? And that was really encouraging, because he got in touch with me. So thank you, Mark. And then similarly, perhaps this was my idea this way around, Luca Romelli, who I think may also be on the call, who was also a former history student of mine. We worked on a project trying to sort of analyze how organizations behaved during COVID. I was with my historian hat on, I got the sense, and I think this is still right, that people aren't really, during COVID, there was a sense of enormity, and there still is amongst, obvious, research communities, but I think most people just want to move on. And speaking from historical research experience, that's a rubbish way to preserve the huge events of the last few years. So some of us, in many ways, trying to preserve many important aspects of that period. And in this one, it was an attempt to try to understand what had happened to people's jobs, especially due to working online. And I'm going to talk about sort of academic concepts in just a moment. We snuck one in, tacit knowledge there. I'll come back to that in just a minute. So I'd like, again, with your permission, I'd love to pass on some lessons learned from all of this, because some of this was so not obvious to me when I started a few years ago. And I kind of wish I could have a time machine and just tell myself, you don't need to be hesitant about X, Y, or Z, because it will be fine. So the first one, you never know what people aren't telling you, right? And I don't know who is not attending this because they don't want to hear it. But I assume that, you know, friends and colleagues in the history world, both academic, popular, and any other interpretation of history, might think this is an attempt to sell out, as it were, and or just to appeal to this kind of government mandate of impact for research. And it really wasn't. It was following my inquiry as to what we can do with history, because I love history, and as some of the departments in the UK are not, for whatever reason, not always doing as well as we might hope. You know, I want to bring whatever gravitas I can to a subject I love. If people can pay me a bit to do it, that's great. But to be honest, you know, if I want to be paid a lot to do consulting, I go and join a strategy consultancy. So I was really encouraged when I would give talks, including history departments, which are the ones that made me by far the most nervous, that people seemed really positive about it. People always wanted to know more. And, you know, I was almost hesitant there as well, because, you know, surely I'm giving away some industry secret. And, you know, maybe, but also you've got to get the word out, right? So that's what we're here to do today. Number two, useful history is a persuasive concept. I didn't come up with this. This was the Resolution Foundation paper. The colleague at Imperial, Tom Waters, who's a historian, read the paper and very kindly provided some feedback. He said it was very interesting, but, you know, useful history, Michael. And I hadn't written useful history in the paper. So in 2 words, he had summarized what I was trying to do without me realizing it. And so thank you, Tom, for that. And this has been a persuasive concept to me to engage with others also interested in this same kind of area. Point number 3, if you're running a business, you've got to do it right. It's obvious, but you know, in academia, we're not really taught how to do this very well. For those of you who do any work through Imperial Consulting or Imperial Executive Education, they usually do this stuff for you. And I am talking with them about various things. But if you're doing it on your own, you're a sole trader where you've got to form a company. You've got to deal with your taxes. You've got to make sure you don't infringe intellectual property. You've got to have the right structure, all these kinds of things that, you know, again, is more obvious to the regular entrepreneur, but something I had to learn, and I enjoyed learning it as well. Point number 4, this is in the extensive literature on impact. Especially because the research excellence framework is just reported, and there was a substantial impact quotient in that. Too much complex language or concepts just will alienate whatever audience you're trying to persuade. And many of our colleagues in our center here at Imperial College are interested in communication and discourse analysis and so on. And that's obvious to them, is you've got to use straightforward language to persuade audiences of the validity of what you're saying. But it isn't always obvious in certain academic specialisms. History, thankfully, has been pretty straight talking over the years and has stayed it. But as I said on the previous slide, that one down there, tacit knowledge, that is a specific sociological concept. I was wary about putting it in the title because it's very well known to academics, but it's not well known to regular people, no matter how educated or clever or decisive or well-funded they are. So that was also a bit of an experiment in terms of putting out a report with something academic-y in the title and using it throughout the writing. And I'll talk about that slightly in a minute, depending on what time we have available. Point number 5, output should be freely available and ideally look attractive. I'll be honest with you, some academic research is not freely available and it doesn't look that attractive. I know loads of people are passionate about this subject, and I agree that publicly funded work perhaps should be publicly available for nothing. And that's a big debate about open access. I'm very respectful of the enormity of that to the university sector. I would just say that, you know, to anyone who's in a decision making in this as to what level should stuff be open access, the competition, which is my next point, produces stuff for nothing. Well, they absorb the cost. It's not free for them, but they'll just give you the stuff for nothing, and it will look really cool as well because they'll get graphic designers making a nice cover for it and good graphs and some, you know, nice pictures and so on. And I know it's really unfashionable in academic articles to do that, but if we're talking about, you know, material designed to have an impact on institutional decision making, I mean, why not do 2 reports? The academic one with mostly text, and then a sort of slimmer one, with a bit more engaging appearance. Because, as I say, something that is important to realize is you could view, for example, history and policy or the Belfer Centre as competition to me. I don't. It's a tiny community and there's lots of things to do out there. But what there is a lot of people trying to get the attention of decision makers. To coin a phrase, the impact ecosystem comprises other academics who are trying to do the same thing, and there's more of them over time. Consultancies who tend to be very powerful and aggressive. Lobbyists who are usually less powerful but even more aggressive than consultancies, and many more other types of institutions potentially globally compete for the attention of decision makers. So a term I have started to use more in my own work and in my teaching is the attention economy, with which some of you will be familiar. And just to think, if someone has 20 minutes of attention as their budget, as it were, how can you best get that? And I know that some people might find that debasing to the grand profession of the life of the mind. But we do live in quite utilitarian times that people want things on budget and on time. So I'm trying to deliver within that remit. So let's talk about what the current projects are for Project Hindsight, which now comprises me and several others. And if anyone else wants to join, please get in touch. We'll see what you can do. Because new skills can add new project ideas, basically. So I've got three, or we've got three, I should say. Alternative data, critical futures, and organizational resilience. And let me talk about each of those for a couple of minutes. So alternative data, if any of you are in the finance or strategy space, this is a huge discussion with, again, very competitive small businesses building up data sets and selling them. They sort of develop licenses, lots of intellectual property work in there, and selling them. And sometimes that alternative data is historical. And so there is always the possibility of finding, and when I say data, I mean, you almost always mean quantitative data. Find quantitative data that's somehow very valuable, that no one's used before, and that you have some kind of legitimate claim to over intellectual property of. And then you could, put it into a big CSV file, package it, put a licensing on it somehow, and then sell it on to somebody. Or develop a whole tool by yourself, and people are doing this. And I can talk about that more if you want. And one thing I really want to do is find the archival material, not the published material of Project Hindsight 1.0, but the archival material with all the original research data. Sorry, there are two layers of research data. The original research data from when the science research was conducted, and then the 1960s research data from when the Project Hindsight research was conducted on the original research. And to try and to really delve into that, because there's could be some fascinating decision-making points going in there that weren't picked up at the time, because I don't think the Department of Defense Vietnam War files were open to radical activists in the 1960s, but they usually are now. So I really look forward to taking that forward and building on this interest in Robert McNamara, which is fascinatingly emerging in stuff. Critical futures, I give a whole talk about this with Mark Pope this time last year, so I can always forward you that video if you like. But building on that work I did with Mark Cox-Smith on the Unilever, it got me thinking that futures are around everywhere, and we're critical of people developing visions of the future that may not always be great, and what evidence are they drawing on here? But there is a bulk of really small c critical literature that is analytical literature. Again, trying to bring the weight of historical evidence to bear on an important sort of decision-making sector or decision-making fulcrum. So, for example, Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize, principally thought was a psychologist, drew on research that said, okay, here's all these predictions. They really, when it comes down to it, people who think they're good at predicting stuff were actually worse than average, worse than random. Then throughout many studies over the years, he's worked out a kind of perfect combination of different kinds of people to predict the future. Absolutely fascinating stuff. But as part of that, super forecasting, very famous book, especially in the finance sector, Often forecasts are made and then nothing. Accuracy is seldom determined after the fact, and almost never done with sufficient regularity and rigor that conclusions can be drawn. And again, this to me fits into this original Project Hindsight 1.0 ambition of we've got loads of data flowing around, lots of decision making based on that, but we don't have a structured way of analyzing any of this and working out like what works based on the evidence. And also, as this said, you could insert review periods, strategies for incorporating more data sets, and all these kinds of things that I've been working on with the others. And having accumulated something like 200 futures now from private sector, public sector, military, think tanks, and all kinds of other institutions and individual people, even bringing a structure to the kind of way that people are developing thinking about the history, I think has been hopefully useful. And as I say, we did a full session on this at Imperial College 1 year ago, and I can forward the video if you like. And even developing this point here on the current situation in futures, you'd think has been very kind of democratized, but my argument has been democratized sort of partly and not in the other sense. So you have many institutions now producing these kind of flat, journey-focused, authentic, pluralists in terms of participants, creative imagery, discussion about dreaming and imagining and so on. And that's great, and I agree with all the tenets of this. You also have a kind of pluralist instrumental mindset whereby it's again a critique of these big bureaucracies making predictions for the future, but in a different way. This is okay. So we still need to be quantitative, apparently, and we still need to be focused on the destination, i.e., the goal is accuracy and being correct. But the idea is to pluralize the sources and to kind of achieve a diversity of sources. And I just providing quotes that summarize the working ideas in this respect. From Yeats, 1914, in dreams begins responsibility. And then I had a little moment of inspiration. Edison, 1927, genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. It's even quantified. So I think there's two different ways of thinking about the future really around us right now. And again, I'm building up a very big data set and now using some quite advanced machine learning methods to get through it because there's so much material. Again, a new skill to my bow, drawing on the skills of others who kindly contributed them, just to study all this stuff and to try to bring a shape to a very inchoate but very powerful sector, and to bring maybe even some ethical bearing on this. Yeah. And then finally, just before we get on to the discussion for 15 minutes, what I've called organizational resilience, and this is so I have, and then we have over time, several outputs on this, an early report of a film, which was launched at Imperial College a couple of years ago, you may remember. And then a more recent one, as I say, trying to fill in a little piece of history of COVID when I think people are forgetting about it. In effect, a kind of crisis management history in a very specific way. And also seeing if putting it, again, with experimentation, trying to get this term tacit knowledge into a kind of more public debate. And with some success, I'm going to tell you about in a minute to an extent. And thanks to Luca for contributing to that. So just to finish from me, and then we can have this hopefully a good discussion. So upcoming work, and for those of you who know me, when I put my mind something to it, it does get done. So I think obviously with a full-time job, full-time family, these things can take time, but that's again where cooperation with others can really contribute here. So a new website coming very, very soon. Thank you to Claudia Cannon and Tunda Bodziska for contributing ideas to that. It is coming soon. Further developments in education and training, not just at Imperial College, but in other respects. Continue the research projects I've just mentioned that really, when they come down to it, say there are some important areas affecting the world today, and we can bring more historical evidence to improve the situation. And then I had hoped to sort of launch this today, but the project's currently under embargo for publication. So there is an upcoming policy, sort of how to make policy report coming out from the UK government, in which this work does feature. And I look forward to sharing it with you when that's published. And I would love to hear from you, what else should we do in this respect? If you personally want to get involved in this kind of work, you know, I'm openly asking you if you would like to join in. And also look forward to any questions you have, as broad or as technical and detailed as you like. And thank you very much for your time.